For it was a witty and truthful rejoinder which was given by a captured pirate to Alexander the Great. The king asked the fellow, "What is your idea in infesting the sea?" And the pirate answered with uninhibited insolence, "The same as yours in infesting the earth. But because I do it with a tiny craft, I'm called a pirate. Because you have a mighty navy, you're called an emperor." These words, written by St. Augustine, encapsulate one of the most fundamental problems of political philosophy. Namely, why governments are morally justified to take actions that no individual or group of individuals are permitted to take. Governments demand a portion of everyone's income, decide what substances may be consumed, regulate and restrict voluntary transactions, and even force individuals to fight their wars. These, among many other things, would be seen as ethically impermissible if undertaken by any individual or group other than one's government. Justifying this special moral status of government is known as the problem of political authority. In this video, relying on the work of contemporary philosopher Michael Huemer and his book The Problem of Political Authority, we will look at the various ways this problem has been approached. Before we begin, it should be noted that our purpose is not to examine whether government is beneficial or a prerequisite for an adequately functioning society, for as Huemer points out, the question is whether the government has certain special rights that you and I do not have, and whether we have certain special duties to the government that we do not have towards anyone else. A government, just like a private vigilante, could be highly beneficial and yet still lack authority. An easy and relatively uncontroversial way to justify political authority would be to say that people explicitly consent to it. This was the route that the 17th century philosopher John Locke took with his social contract theory. As the name implies, the social contract theory is based on the idea that there is a contractual relationship between the government and those governed. However, while Locke's theory is certainly famous, it is now largely of historical interest, because no such contract exists, nor has such a contractual relationship ever played much, if any, role in forming governments. The philosopher David Hume realized this, and suggested that most governments were not formed by contract, but rather through conquest and war. The lack of evidence to support John Locke's theory has not led philosophers to completely abandon the consent theory of government. Rather, instead of suggesting that there is some form of explicit consent between the government and governed, it is now suggested that the consent is implicit. Implicit consent is consent granted not through any verbal or written communication, but through one's conduct. Huemer suggests that there are four main ways that people can potentially grant implicit consent to their government. Firstly, there is the case of passive consent. This is where one expresses agreement to a proposal simply by refraining from opposing it. The second case is that of consent through acceptance of benefits, arising when one commits oneself to accepting certain demands by soliciting or voluntarily accepting benefits to which those demands are known to be attached. The third type of implicit consent can be called consent through presence, arising when one indicates agreement to a proposal merely by remaining in some location. The fourth type Huemer identifies, which is called consent through participation, occurs when one implicitly consents to the rules governing a practice by voluntarily participating in the practice. At first glance, one might think that there is a good chance that at least one form of implicit consent justifies political authority, but under closer examination this becomes doubtful. As Huemer points out, in order for a contract or agreement to be valid, whether based on explicit or implicit consent, it must satisfy certain criteria. For example, for an agreement between two parties to be valid, each party must have a reasonable way of opting out. However, short of abandoning one's home and the jurisdiction of one's government, there is really nothing one can do to opt out and prevent being subject to political authority. For this reason, all the implicit consent possibilities for political authority, except consent through presence, fail to meet this criteria of valid consent. As Huemer explains, almost everyone knows that the state will still impose the same laws and the same taxes on one, regardless of whether one objects to the government, accepts a government service, or participates in the political process. Therefore, one's failure to object, one's acceptance of government services, and even one's participation in the political process cannot be taken to imply agreement. Another criteria for consent between two parties to be valid is the requirement that both parties have obligations to each other which, if unfulfilled, grants the other party adequate grounds for terminating the agreement. These days it may be difficult for people to agree on what exactly government is obligated to do, but most will agree that it includes enforcing the rights of citizens and protecting them from criminals both domestic and foreign. Whether one sees this as the only real obligation governments have, or if some claim governments have further obligations, the fact is that governments do not behave in accordance with the criteria of mutual obligation. There are innumerable historical examples of severe government failures to protect their citizens, and few, if any, examples of a government voluntarily abdicating power. In fact, government failures these days tend to result in increased government power, as more laws are passed on the assumption that they will prevent future failings. The inadequacies of the implicit consent theories to justify political authority have led some to suggest that consent arises through the will of a majority as expressed at the voting booth. The problem with this theory is that to accept it, one must also accept the premise that the opinions of a large group of people can somehow impose obligations on a smaller group. Some may accept this, but it is certainly a view which runs counter to common sense. For example, if you were out for dinner with 4 people, could the consensus of 3 of them that you pay the whole bill make you morally obligated to pay? Furthermore, this belief that majority opinion is enough to coercively impose obligations on minorities can lead to what is called the tyranny of the masses. Comments by some of the greatest thinkers in history reveal their distrust of vesting too much power into the will of a majority. Aristotle wrote, "Unlimited democracy is, just like oligarchy, a tyranny spread over a large number of people." Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what they are going to have for lunch." And Edmund Burke made this comment, "Of this I am certain, that in a democracy the majority of the citizens is capable of exercising the most cruel oppression upon the minority, and that oppression of the minority will extend to far greater numbers and will be carried on with much greater fury than can almost ever be apprehended from the dominion of a single spectre." The difficulty of justifying political authority based on consent, whether it be explicit, implicit, or the consent of a majority, has led some to resort to what are called consequentialist arguments for political authority. The consequentialist argument suggests that the benefits that arise from vesting government with a special moral status are significant enough that they warrant the costs of obedience. Or in other words, political authority is justified by the beneficial consequences that arise from government action. For the consequentialist argument to hold, a government must be seen as providing benefits that outweigh the costs of obedience. And this has not always been the case, as the author Larkin Rose put it. Flip through any history book and you will see that most of the injustice and destruction that has occurred throughout the world was not the result of people breaking the law, but rather the result of people obeying and enforcing the laws of various governments. The evils that have been committed in spite of authority are trivial compared to the evils that have been committed in the name of authority. But even if one believes the benefits of government largely outweigh the costs of obedience, as many do, it is not clear how merely providing benefits can justify the special moral status associated with political authority. If providing benefits gives the individuals who make up government a special moral status, does it not follow that other groups should be able to obtain this special moral status if they provide significant benefits to society? It is doubtful that many people are willing to grant beneficial vigilantes the power of political authority, and so in reply to this question, one may claim that only a government can obtain the elevated moral status of political authority. But such a response would be begging the question, or in other words, assuming what must be proven. And what must be proven in this case is why governments have a special moral status that differentiates them from all others. This issue of how providing benefits can confer government, but no others, with a special moral status, coupled with the open question of just how beneficial governments are, makes the consequentialist argument difficult for many to accept. To conclude, while it is apparent that the problem of political authority is both an important issue and one which has not adequately been resolved, it is interesting that so few people pay attention to the issue. Perhaps David Hume was onto something when he wrote in the 18th century, "No maxim is more conformable, both to prudence and morals, than to submit quietly to the government, which we find established in the country where we happen to live, without inquiring too curiously into its origin and first establishment. Few governments will bear being examined so rigorously."